My name is Susan Van Patten, and I work for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I want to tell you how much I appreciate everybody coming out tonight to meet with us and talk about the draft TMDL. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to give you an overview of that draft TMDL, answer any questions that you may have about it, but we're not taking public comments here tonight. So if you do have public comments, you need to email or mail them to us, and there's a slide that gives you that information as well as so you know where to go. In case you don't know what a TMDL, I'm going to give you the thumbnail version of it. And sometimes people ask us why we're doing one for Honeoye. It's because the water quality impairments are well documented, something like over 50 years worth of water quality impairments. And the pollution source is mainly the phosphorus is driving this. Too much phosphorus is degrading the water quality. And one of the things that the state has as a tool, so to speak, to try to address a body of water that has long-standing water quality issues is this total maximum daily load document, this TMDL. So what does that mean? Because that's a real jargonish term. Really what we're doing is we're looking at all the different sources of phosphorus, both on the landscape and in the water body, making an assessment of what's like an okay amount of phosphorus in the water for fish and plants to grow, and how much is there now, and what's that difference, and what are we going to do as a community to try to reduce that amount back to a level that's appropriate. So that's kind of the thumbnail version of it. We're going to have some presenters who can give you a little bit more, but that's the thing. So it's kind of the order of tonight's meeting is we're going to give a real brief presentation that gives you the quick overview of the TMDL, and then we're going to take your questions. We have a variety of people here from DEC here tonight to try and answer your questions. So in addition to myself, the main presenter is going to be Dr. Louis McCaffrey. He is kind of pinch hitting for us tonight because the author of the TMDL, Robert Kompowski, unfortunately his wife fell ill and he couldn't be here tonight. So we're thankful that Dr. McCaffrey could step in for him. In addition to that, we also had Anna, who is the author of the Comanches Lake TMDL, so he's also here helping us out in case you give us a question that normally Bob would answer. We also have Scott Kishbaugh. Some of you may already know of Scott. He is a water quality specialist, lake specialist. He deals with all types of water quality issues, including HABs for lakes. Sitting next to him is Scott Cook. He is the head of the Finger Lakes Water Hub. And sitting next to him is Stephanie June. She also works for DEC in the Albany office. She works for Scott, and she coordinates the Citizen Statewide Lake Assessment Program, or CSTAP. Where are the rest of my DEC folks? So over here, we have Harris Manning. She's the regional water engineer for this area of the state. And we have Pradeep Jambari. He is a long-standing water engineer in Division of Water. I feel like I might have... Oh my gosh, how could I have done this? I apologize. Maria Isaacson is sitting over there in the corner. She's next to Stephanie. I apologize to all of you. She's a water quality improvement project, the grant program. She can answer your questions for that. So. Okay, so with that, why don't we get going with Louis?
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me at the back? Can you understand my accent at the back? Sorry, I don't come with subtitles. You'll have to cope with the accent. So, thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, I'm giving this talk for Bob Kopowski, who couldn't be here tonight. I had to give a talk for a couple of federal employees a couple of weeks ago, and my colleague told me that giving somebody else's talk is like wearing somebody else's underwear. It feels kind of weird, but it probably will get the job done. So the purpose of tonight's meeting, we're going to talk about TMDLs, what they're for. I'm going to present to you the draft Honeoye TMDL, and then we're going to, the purpose of the TMDL is to then allow the community lots of input on the process of implementation. So TMDL, it's the total maximum daily load. And load, remember, is not just the concentration of a nutrient, it's the amount of a nutrient or a pollutant that is entering a water body. So we can talk about load in terms of pounds per day or kilograms per year. It defines the maximum allowable nutrient load that a water body can stand or absorb and still meet water quality standards. The TMDL identifies the sources of those pollutants, and whether they are concentrated sources, for instance, point sources, or whether they are diffuse, and we call those non-point sources. And it defines and assigns limits to each of those sources. So why did Honeoye Lake receive a TMDL? Well, the lake was listed on a state register of impaired water bodies. It's known as the 303D list. And in particular, it was noted as being impaired for phosphorus. And the Clean Water Act requires us to develop a TMDL to address that impairment. And so we can assign maximum loading into the lake to bring the water quality back to allowable limits. And I'm going to just very briefly talk about the use of computer models in the method of trying to get to that total maximum daily load. So models. We used two different computer models for the TMDL. Why do we use computer models? The reason is that they are much easier to put together and to change around, to tweak the scenarios, to find out what would happen, what would be the outcome if we did a certain action compared to a different action. They can be kind of complicated to put together. We used consultants to put together the models for Honeoye. The ones that we used, as you'll see, simulate what's happening in the watershed and also what is happening separately in the lake. And you can see on the screen there that Honeoye was broken into a whole series of segments, lateral segments and also vertical segments. We run that computer code to see what the outputs are going to be. Much easier to use models than trying to tinker with the actual lake and see what happens. I don't think anybody would appreciate that. It's also easier to run a computer model rather than trying to measure every point in the lake. That would be very expensive and cumbersome. So it does allow us to predict what is going to happen based on a particular style of implementation. Now, limits definitely have, models definitely have limits. There's an acronym in computer science called GIGO. That's garbage in, garbage out. And this British mathematician called Box also said, essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And he also went on to say, it would be really useful to know how wrong a model has to be before it's not useful. So, essentially, there is going to be a certain amount of error in any model, but that model can still remain useful. Okay, so I touched on the two different kinds of models that were run for the Honeoye watershed. First, up on the top left there is the watershed model, which then input into a lake model, and I'll go into those in a little bit more detail. So here you can see the Honeoye watershed. This is viewed from the north, and it also includes a depiction of the land use. Just reminding you what a watershed is, everything inside the watershed drains to a specific point, and in this case it is the outlet to Hanoi Lake. So land use in the watershed was a very important input. The land use we derived from a national land cover data set, which is relatively recent. And as you can see from the color coding, the dark green shows forest makes up 70% of the watershed land area. Open water is 7%, grassland, mowed lawn and so on are much lower percentages. And the way that the watershed model works is that an idea of how much each of these land uses produces in terms of phosphorus per year is put into the model, and based on the percentages we can understand how much phosphorus or nitrogen, for instance, then is exported from those land use types into rivers and then into the lake. So when we look at the Hanoi watershed and how much phosphorus comes from each land use, even though forest takes up 70% of the land area, it's only producing 56% of the phosphorus load into the lake. And the reason for that is that forests tend to export or generate very low amounts of nutrients into streams. Developed land, on the other hand, which was around 23% of the watershed, generated 44% of the phosphorus load. And when you do the calculations, you can see that we can come up with actual amounts of phosphorus which are leaving the watershed. And we've gone a little bit metric on this because we're scientists and engineers. So the forest is exporting almost 400 kilograms per year. That's about 800 or so pounds of phosphorus per year. And the urban areas are a bit lower, 310, that's around 600 pounds of phosphorus per year. So the total is around 700 kilograms, about a ton and a half, sorry, that's not true, about 1,500 pounds of phosphorus. Now, that is not a constant load off the watershed. It varies depending on meteorological conditions. So in very dry years, the amount of phosphorus that's exported from the watershed into the lake is very much decreased. And you can see the opposite is true in wet years. The amount of phosphorus increases. So 2011 and 2014 had higher than normal rainfall, and you can see that reflected in the phosphorus. But on average, there's around 650 kilograms of phosphorus moving from the watershed land areas into the lake every year. Now we get to the lake water quality model, and these are rather complicated. They look at nutrient loads coming into the lake, they look at nutrient loads exiting the lake, and then they look at how nutrients are circulating in the water and also in the plankton, in the plants, and in the sediment, which is very important for Hanoi Lake. So we have two different kinds of phosphorus release into the lake water. We have anoxic, or this is oxygen deficient phosphorus being released into the lake, and we also have oxygenated phosphorus, if you like, being released into the lake. And those two components were accounted for in the lake model. Now, putting all of this together, you'll see that developed land and forested land together produced around 650 kilograms per year of phosphorus. But the amount that the lake was generating itself from its internal sources, that is from the sediment at the bottom of the lake, amounted to almost 8,500 kilograms of phosphorus. So the internal loading into Honeoye Lake is by far the most important source of phosphorus and nutrients. So we've got the values up there. So once we've worked out the loads and the export from the watershed, we've also got the loads from internal sources. If we want to try and bring down phosphorus concentrations in the lake to a standard or to a concentration which will meet water quality standards, we have to reduce these sources of phosphorus. Now, it was attempted during the modelling runs to decrease phosphorus from the watershed into the lake to achieve water quality standards. And it was found that it was such a small amount that it wasn't possible to do so. And so in the modelling runs, internal loading was then decreased as much as possible, and it was found that the water quality standard, which is expressed in terms of micrograms of chlorophyll, could be met if the internal load of Honeoye Lake was reduced as much as possible. So we have built in some measures of safety, or margins of safety into this estimate. It's probably not going to be possible to completely decrease internal load to zero, but there's a possibility that it can be approached. And a TMDL that we have to submit to the US EPA has to include some decrease in watershed loading from phosphorus. And that's the reason why we've estimated just a 10% decrease, particularly because so much of the watershed is forested. So that's essentially what the TMDL is all about. There was a line in the environmental notice bulletin which talked about the appointment of a contractor. We just wanted to make clear that we have appointed a contractor to look at feasibility studies for a variety of different mitigation options in Honeoye Lake. The studies would be the basis for any future permit which would have to be completed for any of these activities to be carried out, for the majority of these in-lake activities to be carried out. Obviously, any mitigation options need to be supported by the local community, and they would also be reviewed by New York State DEC prior to any permit decisions. And the studies don't guarantee that any of these permits would actually be issued or the projects would be funded. So there's a lot of caveats there. But nevertheless, the feasibility studies will be very useful for what eventually happens in Honeoye Lake. So what happens next? Well, we are hopefully going to receive lots of public comments. The public comment period finishes on February the 19th. So we encourage you to email your comments in before that. The DEC will then respond to those comments. If there are any major problems, I'm sure DEC would then modify the TMDL if necessary. And then we hope to finalize the TMDL. It's submitted to the EPA, and then hopefully the EPA will provide its approval in due course. We would hope that it would be certainly before Christmas, but we can't say which year that will be. And, thank you. And then once the TMDL is approved, it's finalized and it's ready to be used by the community. So at that point, DEC will have done much of the work, and it's then over to the community here to think about how to implement it. There are lots of different possibilities enumerated in the implementation plan section. For instance, the internal loading can be addressed potentially by the application of a chemical inactivant. There are a whole series of different techniques for taking out some of that high phosphorus water. But then there are lots of other opportunities to address this. And then for the external loading, that is from the watershed, there are lots of management practices that all of us can take into account. For instance, low phosphorus fertilizer or no phosphorus fertilizer on our lawns. The municipalities can work on some of their ditch practices. Farmers can put in riparian buffers and so on. And then DEC will be very much part of monitoring the effectiveness of those implementation plans. And then if they don't seem to be working, then we would recommend changing them. So it's a plan, do, review approach. And with that, I'll finish and we can take questions.
Okay, so who would like to
I have a
go?
question.
Okay.
What about aeration? I
Okay.
mean, we talked about phosphorus and nitrogen and everything coming in from all the surrounding farmland and, you know, being more careful about what you do on your own property. We talk about, you know, it's an old lake, there's a bunch of old septic systems. Obviously, that has an effect. The reality is, it's all the land from everywhere, all the tributaries and all the creeks that come into that lake. It's all the runoff from building, it's the nutrients in the lake. Aeration is a simple solution. We're talking about, I was here last year when Cornell was here. They've been looking at it for 3 years. And we talked about looking at it, seeing if it's going to work and implementing it. How many years are we going to look at this and not do anything about it when there's a simple solution, which is aeration, which can absolutely take care of the nutrients and deal with, I don't know how it's on this lake. You know, I don't want pea soup on my lake. I want my property to be worth money. I want my children to be able to swim in it. I want to be able to water ski on it and everything else. It's not that tough. It's aeration. We really solve this problem. Why are we not looking at a simple solution? Why are we looking at years of government and going through all these processes and getting everything approved and whatnot to solve something that is really simple science?
Okay, I think Scott will address your question.
Thank you for the question. So as Lewis mentioned, there are a number of different activities that are going on. One of them is a feasibility study that is evaluating several different management techniques, including aeration. You have correctly identified that aeration is a tool that's been used for a number of years in a number of settings. The feasibility study is looking specifically about how that implementation strategy might play out in Honeyway Lake. So I understand the concern. One of the other things that's important to note is that there are many lakes in New York State that are well oxygenated, that are well aerated, and continue to have blooms on it. And one of the common themes that we've seen in many of these lakes that exhibit these blooms is that they have high nutrient levels. Honeyway Lake has high nutrient levels. So at least part of the solution to the problem is reducing nutrient levels. But as you point out, there are a number of other options that are available. Those are being explored just generally and specifically in Honeyway Lake, and they're part of the package moving forward.
I appreciate that, but let me just follow up with that. Yes, we can look at all of that stuff, but the fact is that, you know, my buddy that has 1,500 acres up here that farms soy or corn or whatever, they're still doing what they do. All those nutrients are still coming into our lake. So looking at how to stop that is a very, very long process. When we have something in front of us that is a suggestively, you know, creative way to deal with it today, as opposed to 10 years from now.
So, again, I appreciate the follow-up comment. The TMDL talks about mechanisms for reducing that external loading. And again, if the feasibility study indicates that aeration in some form, whether or not that's aerating the bottom of the lake, aerating the top of the lake, or aerating some other component, is a viable solution moving forward, there are opportunities to move that forward relatively quickly. So the goal for most of these is identify some short-term measures that can help to reduce the problem while the long-term measures are kicking in, because I would respectfully add that, again, nutrients are a critically important part of this, and we have to reduce nutrient levels in the lake to have long-term effects on this. But again, I really do appreciate it.
And that is a long-term solution, you're absolutely correct. Bottom aeration can solidify and solve this thing in a summer. It's not a long-term solution, and while doing that, we can deal with farmers and what they're putting in, and dealing with controlling waterways and what actually comes into the lake. That's an immediate solution to a long-term problem, as opposed to looking at it and how do we slow this down and slow that down for the next, for multiple years.
Thank you for your comment.
Yeah.
Somebody back there have any other?
I was just curious if you could explain a little more of what methods you have to reduce the nutrient level.
Methods to reduce nutrient levels?
Thank you for the question. So the TMDL, as Louis explained, is an evaluation of both those external sources, those that come in from the watershed, the land that's around the lake, all of the points in the land around the lake that drain into the lake, and the sources that come internally. So the TMDL identifies a series of strategies to address those nutrient sources. It's also worth noting, as many of you are aware, that the governor identified Honeoye Lake as one of the 12 priority water bodies for a harmful algal bloom action plan. That action plan, like the TMDL, and they converge in many places, acknowledge that nutrients are a significant source of the problem in this lake. So the HABS action plan identified a number of implementation strategies to reduce some of the external sources of phosphorus as quickly as possible. And there were a number of projects that were funded to help move that process along. As the TMDL indicated, the major source of nutrients in this lake comes from within the lake. And if you think about it, that is really a legacy pollutant, meaning that the phosphorus in the bottom of the lake is what has been deposited over many decades from the watershed into the lake. So it's basically building up. So both the HABS action plan and the TMDL identify internal loading as a significant source of the problem, and the feasibility studies that we just talked about are trying to identify what is the best way to address that internal source of nutrients, with the goal being bringing it down far enough that ultimately many of the water quality problems that brought all of you here tonight would be significantly reduced.
I think what she was asking was, what are some of those strategies?
Exactly. Erosion, dredging, draining.
They're listed right in the TMDL.
Okay.
Well, that's well.
Any other will take care of it for you.
I'm Ed Anna. I'm working on a couple of other TMLs. I didn't work on this one specifically, but I did. Oh, sorry. Sorry, can you hear me better? Yeah. Sorry about that. Don't speak to them like very often. I worked on a couple of other TMDLs. I didn't work on this one specifically, but I did look over it after I heard Bob couldn't be here. And I see in the implementation section are many of the menu items. So I would suggest you look at the website, the section. I don't know what chapter it is in this TMDL called implementation. They include a variety of menu items that are possible. Some of them aren't too practical for this lake, but they do include aeration. And they do include alum as things being studied. And some of the classic other items are things like hypolemnetic removal of material, algicides, although they'd have to be approved by pesticides if you do that. Nutrient inactivation is our buzzword for alum, the alum study going on, but there are other inactivants that are possible. That's subject of a study that some folks are doing for this lake and some others. Hypolemnetic aeration may or may not be destratification, by the way. I point that out because in this lake, the study is focusing on destratifying hypolemnetic aeration, I believe, whereas kinesis, the goal would be to be not hypolemnetic destratification, just hypolemnetic without destratifying. The difference having to do with the nature of the lake. There are differences between the two of them. This water turns over more frequently, I guess, in this lake. So that's destratifying means that well, I do want to go too far into it. But anyway, I would suggest looking over the rest of the reading and the implementation in the website.
I think we have something to add, actually. Yep. Okay, so I think, Maria, you're going to touch on how people could apply for implementation? No. Oh, the projects that were funded so far. Oh, can you just comment on that for us?
Sure. So I work on our water quality improvement project grant program. And we did, as was mentioned, have a few projects on Honeywell Lake funded this last round. So just to give you an idea, and most of these go along with the implementation plan in the TMDL. So a non-point source project was the Honeywell Lake Aquatic Vegetation Management. We had a shoreline stabilization project, a wastewater treatment plant, sanitary sewer overflow improvements, and wastewater treatment plant disinfection. So with the exception of the disinfection, a lot of these align with the TMDL implementation plan, and we potentially fund other of those types of projects, especially non-point source projects that are listed. So a lot of those would be eligible for TMDL funding if they're applied for.
So does that give you a better sense of the types of things that people could do?
No, not at all.
It's in the
Policy.
papers.
Let's apply for this, let's look at
Okay,
this,
sir.
let's do this. Let's do
You've been
something
talking a
that
lot,
matters.
there's lots of people in the room, I'd like to hear from them. I understand that you're concerned, but there are other people in the room. So we listed for you the types of projects that were funded, that could be funded that would help the lake. I'm hearing people say, no, that's not specific enough. If somebody could just articulate for me what the question is you're asking us, so we can do a better job answering it. Okay, go ahead, sir.
What is going to be done now? We got all these studies and everything, I understand that, but it's always planning and planning and planning and nothing gets done. Is something going to be done this year?
We're gonna apply for stuff.
So in a way, you're correct. At this point, there's, the government can't come in and do all the work that's left to be done. And that's why the slide back a few was, what's the community do? So what the community did, for example, is they applied for funding, and now they're going to be able to do some projects such as stream stabilization, some things for weeds, work on your wastewater treatment plant and the overflows. Those are all things that the community's doing that will improve the lake. It's a hard truth that fixing a lake that has impairments, we have no little magic fairy dust that we can sprinkle on the lake that's going to make it better in a very short span of time. I mean, it's the hard fact that none of us like. And what is happening that isn't happening in other lakes that have water quality impairments is there's a lot of attention here. So I know the feasibility study feels like it's excruciatingly slow and things are not being done, but you can't implement aeration or anything else until you know where to put it, how it's going to work. So that's why the feasibility study needs to be done. And please remember that at least you folks have that, because there's lots of lakes that don't even have that. So I don't live on the lake, so I can't say I feel your pain about it being slow, but we fully recognize it and have done everything that we can. Unfortunately, now the community has to do things like apply for funding and implement projects and things like that. Sir?
Well, if you're saying that the problem is internal of the lake, okay, why even bother doing an external load? Drop all that and work on the interior part of the lake.
And that's what the feasibility study is doing, is trying to figure out how...
Yeah, but you're studying all this other stuff. You've already done all that. You're saying it's 8,000, whatever it is, 8,000 to the internal part of the lake, and the rest is only 900? Concentrate on the internal part. Forget about the rest of the crap. This is what everybody wants to know.
And that's a choice the community could make. What the state's doing is doing the feasibility study to see what would work where. And we'll provide that information as soon as we have it. It's not going to be fast. In the meantime, there is a small amount coming from the watershed, and that's why the community has chosen to apply for the grant funding to do something today while we wait for the feasibility study to be done.
Yeah, but the small amount that's coming from the load of the watershed is nothing compared to the load of the internal part of the lake.
Don't disagree with you. But every
I
little
mean,
bit
that's what I
helps.
would concentrate on. I mean, if the water main breaks, you fix the water main. You don't fix the pipe going into somebody's house.
But the thing is, that there's two things. One is, every little bit helps. So it's not like it's harming or taking you nowhere. It is inching you forward toward the finish line by doing these things on the landscape. While we wait for the feasibility study to be done. It's actively being done. It's not like, it's not happening, it is happening.
Well, most of the watershed from the north end of the lake to the south end of the lake is woods, which I understand that they do contribute, woods do contribute. It's not agricultural. So everything north of the lake would maybe be agricultural, but that goes north of us, doesn't even come into our lake.
And that's
Am
what
I right?
And that's what the slide showed, that 70% of this watershed is woods.
Right.
And that's why when you look at the entire load, unfortunately, it's in the water body already. So,
Right, so work on cleaning up the internal part, forget about the external part.
let me take some other questions. Go ahead, sir. Yes.
Well, does the report assess the significance of power boat activity in the nearshore area and resuspension of the phosphorus from the sediments in the plan? Is that significant or is it trivial?
That's an issue that hasn't been very well studied in most lakes in the country. In the few places where it has been studied, most of the evidence suggests that it's a small influence relative to all of the other influences. So again, following up on this gentleman's point, the internal loading is clearly driving most of the problem. I would follow up on one of Sue's points in that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, what we're seeing internally in the lake now is what was coming in externally for years. So while I can understand the frustration that trying to address an external source now when the internal source is significant can be frustrating. But if we don't simultaneously address those external sources, they're going to become the internal sources moving forward. But back to your question, in those nearshore areas, the boating traffic, there's not much evidence that, at least relative to the other influences, that
Okay, so you
that's
look at other
significant.
studies to draw that conclusion for Honeymoon Lake is what I'm hearing.
One could conduct those studies. Our expectation would be that, given that the focus should be on trying to address the internal loading.
Sir, over there.
Yes. First of all, I'm very glad that this report identifies very clearly that it's the internal sources. Now, I read the report, and the two main contenders, there were more, but the two main were alum and oxygenization. Now, the DEC has not permitted alum for, well, ever since we did it in 2006-07. Have they reevaluated the possibility of using alum? Because, I mean, if alum is going to be used, we got to get a permit from the DEC.
What you're saying is correct, sir. I'm going to have Scott tell you about feasibility stuff we've been talking about. It seems to be the word of the day. But that is part of what it's working on.
So thank you for the question. DEC is presently conducting 2 pilot projects to try to address nutrient inactivants. Downstate, 2 water bodies that we're looking to do an application of nutrient inactivants that will help us to evaluate whether or not DEC can adopt a formal policy that will allow its use. There are significant concerns that have been raised by the DEC regulators, and we want to make sure that those issues are addressed before we go full scale into a large nutrient inactivation project. But the intent is that we will have enough information once those studies are complete to say, yes, this is either an option moving forward or we need to consider other options like oxygenation. And many projects, the feasibility studies that we're working with our contractor on are looking at nutrient inactivants, oxygen, combinations of those two.
It's kind of the follow-up there. I mean, alum is used frequently in other states, Minnesota particularly, and widely used in Europe. Is the DEC looking at their experience? I mean, we don't have to learn everything new. A lake is a lake.
You're correct. This is a lake management technique that's been used in many states. DEC's process of evaluating both those pilot studies and a policy moving forward is looking at the results from all of those other states as well.
Hey Scott, you had oxidation on Canisius Lake a few years back, and it's not there anymore. Canisius Lake is another big issue lake. So what good did it do Canisius Lake if it's not there anymore?
Okay.
Hopefully I'm thinking of the example that you were just trying to reference. There have been some recent projects where near the shore in Canisius Lake, they had some bubblers, and I checked into those and chatted with the Lake Association folks. Those were not hypolimnetic aeration items like is being suggested and studied as a possibility here, hypolimnetic aeration being an idea for oxygenation of a major portion of the lake with very fine bubbles such that you would change the chemistry just above the sediment layer. To the bubblers that I'm told about, we're not in that area of stratification. They were not in that area where there's a lack of oxygen near the bottom. What they were doing was attempting to cause churning near the shore. Hopefully I have the correct project in mind that you're thinking of. So that was an attempt to break apart algae masses and that sort of thing. And it may have had a little impact attempted on phosphorus, but it wasn't in a noxic zone, the lack of oxygen zone, so it wasn't impacting as much. Unless I have a totally different project in mind, but that's the one I was thought about.
The man in the back of the room.
So you mentioned the idea of trying to get rid of some of the 10% from urban activity. You split them off into urban and forest. How much of that urban load was from cropland? Because I'm assuming some cropland does drain into the watershed, and I agree. You know, obviously the main source is in the lake itself. But what if you could pass laws in the towns? I don't know what the town of Richmond or Canada has in terms of laws about how much phosphorus can be used in an agricultural setting, and might that be one thing you could do pretty much right away with the support of both communities? You know, I don't know how much of that urban load came from cropland or how much from lawns and so forth. It wasn't broken out that way.
So the model actually didn't simulate cropland separately because it was below a certain threshold. It was below 5%. And so because of that, a whole series of land uses were then aggregated together.
But what I'm wondering is, did the cropland produce more of the phosphorus than any of those other things that were grouped in that aggregate? You know, crops use, the spread on cropland versus in an urban setting, somebody putting in a tiny little bit of phosphorus on the lawn. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if the quantities made a difference in any of that.
I think this is one of those questions that Bob would have answered if he was here. I'm sorry. I don't think we can answer that. So if you want to see me afterwards, I'll write it down and we can get back to you on that. I think that's the best way to deal with that. The man right there in the white beard?
When will the feasibility studies for alum and aeration be done?
We expect those to be done over the next several weeks. We'll then take some time to evaluate the findings from those feasibility studies and then use that information moving forward to identify what options can be considered to do it. So we expect those over the next couple of weeks.
They'll be implemented this year with the aeration and alum?
It's premature to say because we don't know what the feasibility study is going to be telling us, but we should be getting that information over the next couple of weeks.
Hang on. Excuse me, I would really appreciate if people didn't yell out because they have a lot of hands up and we're trying to get to each person and give each person a chance. So if you could please be considerate of the other people in the room and not put your hand up. The woman back there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this evening's presentation. My question is clarification on the continuum from the DEC to the EPA. And that ultimate approval at the EPA, is it oversight? Is it administrative? Is it budgetary? What's happening at the EPA and how politicized does the EPA get in that approval process?
Well, typically in previous years, we generally try to have this completed as part of a work plan, work agreement, any TMDLs, by the end of the federal fiscal year in reality, which is, September. But that's just for their work plan purposes. In reality, what is occurring, and that's like secondary, is the goal. Our contacts at EPA Region 2, which are a technical group in New York City, will review all of our calculations. What you see in the website, if it doesn't pass muster, then they won't approve it. And sometimes we've gotten some difficult technical calculation challenges from them, or explanations. Sometimes they really want to have some very thorough explanations, quite honestly. The people we talk to directly are not politicians. In fact, my primary contact in the past has been someone who's been on a national modeling work group and done one or two of the seminars for teaching of modeling. Now they will want to have what their buzzword is, reasonable assurance. If they don't think it'll work, a reasonable assurance, they won't pass it. In fact, an example where that's a documented true statement is the fact that Vermont recently had their Lake Champlain TMDL revoked. It was a meeting muster, and they had to redo their portion of the Lake Champlain TMDL. So they do mean that as something that as one of their criteria. So we want to have a technically valid, good document. And that includes, when you're talking about EPA, valid documentable studies. So this feasibility study, to prove to them, is kind of important.
Go ahead, sir. You had a question?
Oh, yes, I apologize for interrupting. But you mentioned in a few weeks you'll have some results. So could by July be a date that you'll have a presentation as to what's going to be done?
So again, I'll just start by saying it's premature to build out a timeline because we don't know what the feasibility study is going to show us. But if the feasibility study indicates that, for example, aeration may be a valid process for trying to address the internal loading that's coming into the lake, the feasibility study would include some rough evaluation of sort of mechanically what that might look like. That information would serve several purposes. One, it would help us to identify if a permitting program is going to be necessary to support that, to protect the environment at the same time that work is ongoing. It's also one of the requirements for eligibility for some of our grant programs. So a feasibility study is necessary for an application for funds to support that project. That funding cycle may line up pretty well with when the feasibility results come out. But again, I'll circle back to it. And I know it's a frustrating answer, but until we see what the feasibility study looks like, it's premature to say this is what the specific timeline is going to look like.
In the back, all the way in the back. Yep.
Hi. I know that the legacy phosphorus that's been in the lake has been there for a very long time. And we've had, over the past 10 or 15 years, we've had good years and bad years. And in every bad year, when we have lots of HABs and lots of algae and peas and soup and all that, there's always been lots of rain, like in that chart that you showed. The phosphorus that's in the water is on the earth that is wetter. And what I've noticed is that we have things like last year we had a really bad year, and last winter we had, algae coming up through the holes in the ice. And the summer before we had the inlet all excavated out to make all those meandering streams, and all that phosphorus that was in those farm fields was then basically exposed. All the rains came, and there were just tons of suspended phosphorus coming into the lake, and we had a really bad year. And on previous years when we had the floods, there was lots of garbage coming down in all the creeks. There was diapers and car parts and you name it. And again, there was tons of suspended phosphorus in the lake. So the years where the the harmful algae blooms are the worst, are the ones where we have lots of rain and we have new phosphorus coming into the lake. So how does the legacy phosphorus that's been there for 100 years, how does that, I mean, it seems like that's not, it's there, and I know that's the majority of the phosphorus, but that's not what seems to make the algae blooms worse some years and not bad the other years.
I'll start with, I appreciate the summary of how the conditions in the lake do vary from year to year. That's our experience. As was mentioned, there's been monitoring by DEC in recent years and by other partners over other years, and we've seen the same thing. We've been working very closely with the Honeoye Valley Association to try to document the extent to which those blooms are occurring. It is still our belief that the internal load is the most significant part of the problem, but it may be that the timing in which those, the timing of those external sources of phosphorus, what's coming in with rainfall from the watershed, may be the trigger point for certain blooms to hit. So it comes back to that point again that the primary focus is to try to reduce that internal loading, but the external loading, the watershed management actions that we've been talking about, can still play an awfully important role, and we do think the combination of those two things will help to improve conditions in the lake.
All the way back in the maroon and the desk. Yep.
I was recently over at Canada's Lake and also over at Hemlock Lake over the weekend, and both of the north ends of those lakes have been engineered and modified for flow and management, various different things. Obviously, they're part of a watershed. My concern or my question is are we looking at the possibility of the lack of flow over the years because of sediment and such that's built up at the north end that is now actually, our lake actually seems to be rising as we get these bad rains and everything else? We're not really at the level that we would normally be at for this time of year. Is it a concern long-term that we have a cork at the north end that stretches from here to West Bloomfield?
So again, I realize I'm sounding like a broken record, but we'll come back to our belief is that the phosphorus levels in the lake, the internal phosphorus and the external phosphorus are significant. One of the things that that Lewis mentioned in the presentation is that this process is an iterative or an adaptive management approach, and as those internal loads are reduced and as the external loads are reduced, if we see that there are other management actions that are needed, like changing the flow out of the lake, those are things that can be considered. We expect that's going to have less of an impact on the things that we're just talking about, but everything should be in the process of being evaluated. It's just that's not the first thing out of the box.
Thank you.
The man in the hat.
Ryan, I'm a resident and I also work for ATIP Control Pond and Lake Management Company. One is, did you guys take core samples to see how far the depth of the phosphorus goes in the sediment? And two, my concern would be is with the aeration. The suspended phosphorus, once the aeration is implemented, could that be harmful to the ecosystem and would cause more fish die?
I can address the second question first. One of the reasons we're doing this feasibility study is to try to understand positive and negative what the effect of any of these management techniques might have, aeration, nutrient, and activation. The feasibility studies that we talked about are looking at lake management through the same lenses, recognizing we're a regulatory agency and part of our responsibility is to try to protect the habitat and to protect the organisms that are in that water body. So we certainly don't want to do something that's going to create more of a problem, which, and again, I understand the frustration that it takes long for these things to do, but part of our responsibility is making sure that we're not creating a worse problem. In terms of the first question, the sediment sampling, we actually have the contractor here in the room who may be able to describe just a little bit about some of the work that is ongoing in the midst of trying to understand the feasibility of some of these options.
Hi, good evening. I'm Steve Souza. I've worked on the lake since about 2004, so worked with Jack and a number of others, Terry. So I've had some opportunity in working with Bruce to study the lake. There has been a significant amount of data collection, and in terms of sediment sampling, Cornell recently over the past probably 5-6 years has done some exceptional sediment analysis, so we do have a reasonably good estimate of the amount of phosphorus that's in the sediment, how that is deposited, and the relationship of that phosphorus to iron. That iron-phosphorus bond is what really determines how much phosphorus gets liberated from the sediments under periods of anoxia, when there's no oxygen down at the bottom. And we are looking at the use of aeration. And so there's not maybe a misunderstanding. It's not so much that the lake is subject to a high degree of turbulence, which stirs up the entire water body. That's not the point of doing aeration. The aeration, the systems that are used, particularly in a lake like Kaneohe, is essentially like it's an air. Compressed air is utilized to move the water column and expose the bottom waters to the surface so that you get reoxygenation via exposure to the atmosphere. So we are looking at aeration systems that, as noted previously, that destratify the water column, prevent it from becoming thermally stratified, and the bottom layers becoming segregated from the surface water, and then that results in no oxygen down at the bottom, and that phosphorus iron bond from breaking down and releasing a lot of phosphorus into the water column. So we are conducting those analyses, as Scott pointed out. We're very close to issuing our report to the state, which will then be reviewed, and then evaluations made of what is the best system and how much it's going to cost and how much it's going to cost to operate annually and what the benefits are going to be. So we're very close to completing those analyses. But to answer the question, aeration is a very large component of the long-term management of the lake.
Thank you. There was a question, I said, from the other shirt.
Yeah. How many of you DEC folks are from Region 8 or elsewhere?
We have 2 that work in Region 8.
I want to say that for those of you who are impatient, as I am, and who also believe that the solution really does involve working on long-term loading, I want to say that the impatient side of me has reported to the DEC on 3 occasions through Region 8, through a fellow by the name of Luke Scannell, I think, or Scannelli, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. And on those 3 occasions, I've seen dramatic improvement in the conditions that I saw that were contributing to large amounts of groundwater into the lake. These were by, in one case it was the county, in another case it was an individual, and in a second case it was the county. But in all 3 cases, the DEC, when they finally took action, got very good results. And it made me feel very good about the short-term effect that each of us can have by simply reporting brown water entering the lake, because that's where the nutrients are as well. So congratulations to the DEC, and I hope that more of you will call. It may not be the ultimate focus for a quick solution, but it is part of the longer range answer. Thank you for the feedback, sir.
Back there?
Yeah, could you, it's basically 2 parts, could you just talk about some of the bullet points of the feasibility study? What are those points that you're looking at for feasibility? And secondly, on the cost, because everything costs, how should the town of Canadice and the town of Richmond and the county of Ontario pay for your recommendations once these feasibilities are done?
first question about the...
One of the bullet points of feasibility.
Okay, so as with any feasibility study, I mean, we're tasked to look at anything that potentially could be utilized to address the phosphorus load in the lake. Be quite honest with you though, because the internal load is the driver, the focus is both on aeration and the use of a nutrient inactivant. And so those are the two items that we are really focusing on. Probably some of you have seen reports that I've done in the past that have addressed some of the external loading and things that could be done to minimize some of that. And some of those actions have been taken by the towns and by individuals. You know, the real source is the internal load, and the focus is on aeration and use of a nutrient inactivant.
Those are results. What are the bullet points of feasibility? What do you look at? Cost, is it viability?
Oh, okay, in terms of that, right. It's cost, it's the return on the investment, it's the longevity of the application, annual maintenance, you know, with aeration there's going to be an initial capital cost for installation, and then there will be obviously costs to operate. All of those costs are being taken into consideration. Same thing with nutrient inactivation. That is allowed, the initial cost, and then what would be some follow-up measurements that would need to be taken to evaluate the effectiveness and the longevity of that treatment.
To answer the funding part of the question, the Water Quality Improvement Project program that I talked about earlier, there was a handout out front, and that funds a lot of the non-point source type projects that are listed in the TMDL, also wastewater projects, and then I also included a handout that has other funding sources and links to all of those. For WQIP, that's the Water Quality Improvement Project, municipalities and soil and water conservation districts are eligible to apply. And TMDLs and HAB action plans also factor significantly into the scoring for those projects, so it benefits how those projects score and their likelihood to be funded.
Man with the hat?
Yes, I see one of the things up there is a possible implementation would be withdrawal. Would that be like a dredging or a filtering of the sediment, removal of the sediment from the bottom of the lake?
That's what that means. No. I apologize, I misspoke. Sorry.
So what that's referring to is hypolimnetic withdrawal, meaning taking water out of the bottom of the lake without disturbing the thermal layers, with the idea that the nutrients are built up in the bottom waters. By taking them out of the system, you're essentially starting the process of flushing that out of the sediment. So sediments are going to continue to release that, but the idea is to take it out before it really becomes problematic. As Steve mentioned, they're among all of the options that are being considered as part of that feasibility study.
The woman all the way at the back.
Well, thanks for coming to this community to present. Appreciate that very much. It sounds like, you know, the biggest bang for a buck, the focus is on aeration and the alum treatment. So just as I'm understanding it correctly, even if these feasibility studies show a really high percentage that they could be effective, they could not be implemented until after the TMDL is finalized, which is after the EPA has approved it. So we are at a minimum a year away, is my understanding correct?
So the individual some of the individual implementations that are identified here, so nutrient inactivation, aeration, are sort of running in parallel with the TMDL, and that the TMDL doesn't need to be completed before those projects can be considered. Permits can be applied for, and so on. So they are parallel processes. They're connected together, obviously, in many ways, but we wouldn't necessarily say an application for the use of one of these tools would need to wait for the TMDL to be filed.
No, this is the
I know you have a question. Hang on. I got to get to everybody else first, and we'll do a second round. Sort of like seconds on dinner. Is there anybody who hasn't asked a question that wants to ask a question before we go to the seconds? Okay. It's all yours.
I'm not being impatient, I'm just trying to speak loud enough so that everybody can hear. Why isn't the EPA working with you right now if we have these problems with several Finger Lakes? Is it political problem?
So, Honeyway Lake, as was mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, is on the 303D list, the federal impaired waters list. There are many, many, many lakes, unfortunately, in New York that are on that list. And we're trying to balance as many of those as possible. I would dare say that your equivalent at every one of those other lakes would like us to solve the problem right now. And we would like to solve the problem.
Not right now. Why aren't they working with you right now?
You're talking about EPA?
Yes, the EPA.
So as was outlined here, the process is we need to draft the TMDL, we need to get feedback from the local community, finalize for EPA's approval what that TMDL is. They have other TMDLs from us that they are reviewing that are further down the process. So that they're balancing all of those at the same time we're trying to balance.
But if New York State has that many problems with the lakes, with that many lakes, the same problems, why isn't the EPA working with you right now?
So let me give you a couple of examples. There are, I don't have the number off the top of my head, several hundred lakes on the state 303D list that are impaired for acid rain. There was a single process, all lakes having the same problem that was being used to address that problem. And there's been significant progress that's been made in that. There are a number of other water bodies that are all impaired because of mercury in the fish, independent of acid rain per se. And there's a multiplying process to try to get as many of those together and get a single solution to those problems. This is like many of the other lakes, a single lake. It has some of the same problems. And one of the things that we're trying to do is for those other water bodies that have implemented their TMDL or in the process of developing their strategies to take the lessons from those and apply it here so none of us waste our resources on going down a path that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I do really understand the frustration in the process. It's just there are unfortunately many of these that we're trying to work on simultaneously.
Other questions from folks? In the back?
I'd like to report some groundwater in the lake today. On the west side of the lake where the new water main is going, there's half a dozen locations where groundwater is going into the lake. And they have silt fences at each one, but some of them are on the wrong side of the grade. So maybe the DEC can do a little inspection next week or something and correct that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. Other questions, comments? Go ahead.
This woman up top asked what kind of a time frame that we should be looking at. This is something you, thank you for your answer, but I don't think we got a time frame. We got that we have to go through all the processes, but sort of time frame we feel like we're looking at reasonably.
So are you talking about a time frame for the implementation strategies of the TMDL?
Well, I'm quite sure that but when Bob's working on this again, he'll be attempting to submit it to EPA within a month or two, depending upon how many comments and how much rewriting needs to be done. And we certainly will, as just like the Kinesis one, we wanted to get this submitted and hopefully approved within a few months. And then if there's any significant flaws that they see, we might need to reduce some portion of it. I think that the question is responding to the question partially, do you have to wait until the TMDL is approved before these treatments can occur? And you don't, but you do get extra points with the TMDLs, of course, as what the WQIP person said. There should be an approved, there should be really an approved TMDL I'm not committing, but not very far in the future if there's no major changes that have to occur. And, you know, and I gave you an example already where if there is a significant problem, it can be revoked, like the Vermont TMDL for Lake Champlain. But if things go well, it certainly should be a 2019 and not at the end of 2019, in my opinion. But that's not a commitment.
There's a possibility we'll see it this year, but it very well may be the following season.
There's too many variables. So the first step is to know, we have to respond to all the public comments. And we don't know what they're going to say, and we don't know how much editing we're going to have to do for the document. So if there's a lot of editing, then obviously that takes longer. I'm not saying don't send us comments, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying we have to look at the comments, we have to respond to every single one. Some of them are just writing an answer, and some of them are actually editing the document. So you don't know how long that's going to take. And then that obviously goes through an internal review. And then we send it to EPA, and you just don't know how long EPA is going to take. Again, looking at the fatal flaws, you read it through, they think it's technically sound, and they go very quickly. They find something that they want us to go back and redo or explain, all those take time. So, to be honest, we're looking to get off of our plate as much as you folks want it done. And it's not going to, you know, as much as we can, we're going to try to move it forward. It's just there's too many unknowns for us to say, oh, on X date, it's going to be done. So that's the best we can do. Yes, Brad?
So you said Vermont got revoked. So how far back did that put them?
Theirs was already passed. Theirs was already approved, and they revoked their approval.
Yeah, they actually had a different EPA region. They're in EPA Region 1, which is New England. And they had to redo their TMDL. And in the process to assure reasonable assurance, they actually had a bunch of new laws passed in Vermont, more regulations for watershed management, for farms, and a segment by segment. There are 13 segments considered in Lake Champlain, and they have, not all of them are Vermont, but they have a segment by segment battle plan to evaluate every few years. So they had to do a lot of significant changes, but now they've got it passed again, and a lot more funding, and a lot more laws. But
How many years did it take for it to get passed again?
well, I heard about the problem about 4 or 5 years ago. It took a couple of years, I think, to go through the fruition of it. And EPA actually did a lot of the modeling themselves to make sure they liked it better. So it took 2 or 3 years.
So the EPA actually worked with them?
They did. EPA Region 1 did. Yes.
The lady in the green shirt?
You ended up using the withdrawal strategy or any other type of dredging strategy. Is there a plan for where that water or where that soil is going to end up? Or is that for further down the line?
That would all be part of the process, part of the evaluating the feasibility and the environmental fate of whatever strategy is done. All of those things have to be considered. If there's dredging, where the disposal is going to be, what monitoring would be needed to be done to accomplish that. If there's a hypomanic withdrawal and water is taken out of the lake and moved downstream, what effect that would have on the downstream water bodies. So that's all part of the process.
Go ahead.
Again, I believe, as you mentioned, some of the things that have been funded recently, and one of them being something to do with the sewage treatment plant in town of Richmond, I believe. Or was it funding for the lift pumps that don't have backup power?
So the project, it went to Ontario County, they were the applicant, and it was for the Honeoye Lake wastewater treatment plant, and it was for sanitary sewer overflow improvements, increasing hydraulic capacity and eliminating overflows on Main Street.
That would be actually north of the lake, and I don't know how that would impact the lake.
Right.
It
must have just been in the watershed.
Lake,
Yeah.
it sounds like, but that article at least in the newspaper, made it sound like it was something special for Honeyway Lake residents.
Mm-hmm.
And in reality, I don't think it had anything to do with that. It might be better if somebody funded backup power for the lift stations. which as far as I know, have not been dealt with.
Yeah, I don't know if that one was applied for or not. I don't have the full list of unfunded projects with me. Yeah, they could certainly apply. WQIP goes through the consolidated funding application every year, and that's typically announced at the beginning of May. So we have a round every year. Every year is slightly different, but we expect next year to be pretty similar to what the priorities were last year.
All the way in the back?
Yes, at what point will the feasibility studies be available for public review?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, it needs to be complete DEC review, which would be done shortly after it was received. I don't know what the timeline is. It would be shortly after that. I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Will normally be available for public review at some point in this process?
This is a somewhat unprecedented project, and I don't know what the protocol is for it. But I think this is another example that if we can get contact information from you, we can follow up. I just don't know the answer to that question.
Go ahead.
I'm reluctant to ask this, but I'm trying to understand the funding for some of this. You know, when it says it's like 75-25, is it matching funds? Do you have to come up with the cash up front? How organized is Honeywell in acquiring the funds that we need to actually pay for the alum or the aeration equipment? Where is that money going to come from, and how will it work?
Yep, so the 25% is the local match, it's 25% of the grant amount. So it would come from whoever the applicant is. It could be the municipality or the Soil and Water Conservation District, depending on the type of project.
Sounds like a lot of money, and I'm wondering how Honeywell should have that kind of money.
Right, yeah, match can be in-kind services, it's not necessarily cash upfront. So it could be staff time.
But it is a reimbursement grant, I think was her question. The
Right.
money needs to be put up front.
Right, yes, you're correct. It is a reimbursement grant program, so the money has to be spent upfront and then you get it back.
So that's an interesting.
Right. It's not everything upfront at once. It's, as you make your expenses, you put in requests and you get the money back quarterly.
But once again, I think it's important for the community to know that it is a reimbursement grant. So the money does need to be put out and then reimbursed.
Right.
It needs to be.
Yes. Oh, so she just wants me to say that it is a reimbursement grant program. So the community does put the money up front. Quarterly, they ask for reimbursements back of the money they've spent. And they receive back 75% of that, and that 25% is the match. Like I said, that's not necessarily cash. It could be things like staff time and in-kind services.
Other questions? Oh, go ahead.
So algal blooms are not new, right? They've been studied for a long time. These seem to be happening on a lot of different lakes. Is this a cyclical event going on in the environment that we can't even do anything about? Is it going to go away in 2 years and then we take credit for all our hard work and it's just going to go away by itself?
We love it. But I think the expectation is not. So a little bit of background in response to the first part of the question. Cyanobacteria, which are what blue-green algae are, they're billions of years old. These things have been around for a long time. There is some evidence that we've seen this in New York for several hundred years at least, based on some writings from Samuel Champlain looking at Oneida Lake, just as one example. So it's not a new problem by any means. Over the last decade or so, it's clearly attracted a lot more attention. We, DEC, have documented more than 400 water bodies in New York State that have blooms, which is an enormous number. Some states don't even have 400 lakes. We have 16,000 lakes. So that might appear to be a small number, but it seems to be growing each year. There's all indications that this is a growing problem. Until a couple years ago, there really wasn't much, if any, evidence of blooms on Skaneateles Lake or Canandaigua Lake, yet they've experienced them in the last couple of years. We know that lakes that have high nutrient levels, high phosphorus levels, are far more susceptible to blooms that don't. So again, this strategy of trying to reduce phosphorus levels in the lake, we expect is going to reduce the likelihood of blooms. But it is probably not realistic to assume blooms are going to go away entirely, because we do see them in a very small number of water bodies that don't have really high nutrient levels. There is no indication at this point that the problem is going to get any better, and with climate change, or at least the warming of water bodies, and all of the things that come with that, changes in rainfall, longer growing seasons, changes in thermal stratification, and selectivity for cyanobacteria, and lots of other things. Every expectation is this is a problem that is not going away. We don't know whether or not it's going to get worse. We also don't have all of the answers as to why these blooms are occurring. The governor's Harmful Algal Bloom Initiative funded a tremendous amount of research into trying to understand this, including research very close to here in several of the Finger Lakes. But we still are missing a lot of information. We simply don't know. But again, I'll emphasize, as we learn time after time after time, there is a very strong connection between nutrients, specifically phosphorus, and bloom. So reducing nutrients, there's every indication it's going to reduce the likelihood of blooms. But we can't say that they're going to go away. And we can't say that this problem is going to solve itself. There's no indication of that.
Other comments or questions? Oh, right there in the back. Sorry about that. Miss Jim.
First time I heard was about the home treatment of the lake. They did that previously. And that can only be done, as I understand it, from the outside weed edge around the main basin of the lake. If they can't put the alum onto the weed beds and have it be an effective strategy is limiting the nutrients. Since they did the last one, there's been quite a bit of changes to the weed bed. So from gravel coming in massive amounts during the floods, which covered up a number of them, in years where they had the very, very dense blue-green algae blooms, some weed beds didn't get enough light to survive to the winter. So right now, that's a radically changing situation. Would that make the alum treatments basically be ineffective?
So you touched on a key point there, rapidly changing. The science of alum treatments is rapidly changing as well. So from the early 2000s, when this lake did have an alum treatment, that had, by most indications, some improvement to the lake that didn't last for very long. The science has changed enough so that the expectation is that if an inactive treatment, could be alum, it could be one of the other chemicals, some of which weren't available at that time, is the strategy moving forward. The amount that would be put in, the way it's put in, the locations in which it would be put in, are all benefiting from the science that has changed over this last 15 years or so. It is a challenge. This would not be an easy lake to do an alum treatment on. But if all indications are that's the right tool, it would have a minimal effect on the environment, and New York State develops a program to allow its approval, which is what these feasibility studies, the pilot studies are looking at, then all the pieces may come together, and this may be one of the more appropriate strategies moving forward. So again, I'll touch on the word that things are changing, but the science has changed as well, and we learned from the last treatment. We may be able to learn in a way that if an alum treatment is done here, it can be done better than the past.
The second question, real quickly, apparatus for the aeration of bottom, mix up nutrients and so forth. How susceptible that is to be the animals being proposed to during fishing with heavy lures, things of that nature?
Could you just repeat that again? I didn't catch all of that.
What I was wondering is, they're talking about installing equipment to aerate the nutrients at the bottom of the lake. How susceptible would that be to damage, say, from people throwing out an anchor, or there are some people that use heavy weights for fishing that would bounce the bottom of the lake? Is any of that equipment
Yeah, the equipment wouldn't be susceptible. I mean, the aeration equipment, again, is designed to really keep the water column unstable. The problems that occur is when the water column becomes stable. So by mixing that water column and allowing that deep water to be exposed to the surface, that's what we're, that's the objective of the aeration, prevent anoxic conditions down at the bottom. The equipment, if I'm following you correctly, would not really be susceptible to, damage by, users of the lake. Setting waters that are going to be deeper than probably about 9 to 10 feet, because that's where the problems occur. And you don't really need to aerate the shallow perimeter of the lake. So I think that's what you were asking.
Right, except for the shallow part, a lot of people still anchor use the deep reporting to the lake. I mean, lures to their lures.
Right.
Just to be far enough below the bottom of the lake.
For the most part, I mean, the airlines themselves are negatively buoyant. They're about an inch internal diameter. They have a lifetime warranty on them. I've done aeration in a lot of lakes, and equipment stays down on the bottom for years. I've had some lakes with aeration equipment in it now for like 25 years with minimal amount of upkeep needed of the equipment. And those lakes are heavily fished and heavily boat, a lot of boats. So, I mean, those things are taken into account in the overall design. But I would not expect that to be a big problem.
So you're not going to hook it with your anchor when you're out there?
There's a possibility of doing that, but it's not like you've got like so much equipment down at the bottom of the lake that everybody that drops an anchor is going to be tying into the line. And we can delineate those areas as well so that we're going to know where every single diffuser is. That can be identified. They'll all be GPS coordinated. So, in terms of long-term maintenance, you know where they are. And that information can be made available to people so they understand in certain areas that there is some sensitive equipment down at the bottom of the lake.
Other questions that people have? Any other things they want to ask us or discuss? Go ahead.
I got one more. It might be for this gentleman here. Of the lakes that have been aerated, what are the measurable results?
When done correctly, really good results. And I've published papers, on the improvements both in terms of water quality, reduction in phosphorus loading, and the associated decrease in nuisance algae blooms. So when done correctly, it can have a very positive impact.
Anything else? All the way in the back?
The aeration is to destabilize the nutrients, to raise them up, right? Do you need a positive flow out of the lake to carry those nutrients out?
No, that's not the purpose of the aeration. The aeration is designed to maintain oxygenated conditions at the bottom of the lake. Who was the one that asked the question? So it's not that you're stirring up the bottom and releasing nutrients. You're doing just the opposite. You're maintaining oxygenated levels at the bottom of the lake so the phosphates stay bound to iron and don't get released from the sediment. So the purpose is to maintain an oxygenated deep water zone. And so you don't need to worry about flushing anything out because you're keeping that phosphate bound to iron and segregated in the sediments. Negative effects, yeah, there's negative effects, and typically it's when systems are undersized, not properly installed. They haven't been really vetted so that they're not utilized correctly. Those are typically problems with not doing your homework, and not really understanding, the ins and outs of why it's being done.
So as far as the habitat and what I'm saying is, if everything was installed properly, has there ever been a negative effect?
No. Nope.
Go ahead.
If I heard it right, you said that you were studying this like since 2004. How deep is the phosphorus on the water?
Yeah, I'll have to take a look at it. Off the top of my head, I'm not going to be able to answer your question, but, in terms of the soft sediment layer, in certain areas, we've got about 1 foot to 2 feet of soft sediment. The phosphates, as Scott has pointed out, over years deposit in the lake. They're, at the bottom of the lake. As long as they maintain, in a bound state with iron, and there's more iron in the lake than there is phosphorus, so you should always have a control over that internal load. It's only when we have anoxic conditions at the bottom that it becomes a problem. So, to answer your question, we know in certain areas, and maybe Bruce, you could answer that, because Dr. Gilman has done a number of sediment cores. We've used a lot of this data, but Bruce, do you want to just add to that?
Yes, it was back in the early 2000s that I used a 1/2 meter core, so about 1.5 feet down into the water column. It's a weighted sampler, and no problems getting into the bottom. So it's probably softer at even greater depths than that. Using the sedimentation rate that was published for Honeoye Lake, this was out of graduate work done over at Syracuse University, I extrapolated that I was back about 150 years in time at the bottom of my 1/2 meter core tube. The amount of phosphorus at the surface compared to the amount at the bottom of the core tube, which is going back in time about 150 years, it increased with depth. So that speaks to the historic changes in land use. The watershed was probably cleared of forests during the early European settlement time period, and it's now recovered to the amount of forests that you see today. When it was cleared some 200 to 300 years ago, they were not using silt fabric, they were not using straw bales, they were not building stormwater basins to collect sediment, they weren't putting stone check dams in ditches, they weren't restoring wetlands. All that was not part of the land use strategy in those early years. So it's not surprising that there's more phosphorus with depth as you go down into that area. I did 30 cores in the deeper area of the lake, and I was interested to see how it compared to shallow areas in the lake. So I also did 3 cores in the shallow area. And that's a published report. You can send me an email on our college campus in Canandaigua. I have that electronically and can send that out. Steve used that in some of his earlier nutrient modeling and watershed modeling that he's done. And there also are some other box cores that have been taken by others, but the purpose of those was to look for heavy metal contamination and things like that. I specifically wanted to know how much phosphorus was down in the bottom sediments. And this was when we were first developing that concern for internal loading in the lake, and I wanted to have it documented and how much nutrient was down in the bottom.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We appreciate that. Go ahead.
You use aeration, is that run seasonally or year-round?
It's done seasonally, so it's conducted typically from about, in this lake would probably operate from about May through about the end of September.
Would it be multiple aerators throughout the lake? I mean, how many are you talking?
Yeah, I mean, so there'd be a single power source and multiple diffusers, concentrated in the deepest areas of the lake.
Electric, I assume.
I'm sorry?
Electric, generator?
The generators yeah, the compressors are electric. And yeah, again, the concept is the compressed air that's put into the water is not what's oxygenating the water. You're creating a convection current. You're taking that deep water, moving it up to the surface. And that happens in this lake on its own. And the problem with honey oil is that it goes through periods where the bottom becomes, it's not mixed, it's what's called a polymictic lake, which is just a fancy term meaning that it stratifies and destratifies over and over again during the summer. And some of the comments about wet years versus dry years does have an effect on the stability of the water column. And that can have an effect on what's happening with the severity of the internal load. So all those things are taken into account. But, to answer your question directly, a number of diffusers, those diffusers are placed primarily in the deepest sections of the lake because that's the portion of the lake that needs to be mixed to the surface and kept in an unstable state so that you're constantly reoxygenating those bottom waters. Yeah.
So the theory of a couple of weeks of calm periods and then a huge windstorm either from the south or the north, and we flip-flop the lake and the water that got deoxygenated that's down there in the bottom comes to the surface. A few days later, we have a boom. That's the Cornell. That's not my theory. That's what I heard from Cornell last June or May.
Exactly, and that is a big problem. And under those periods where it's anoxic and there's no oxygen down at the bottom, the phosphorus release rate. Phosphorus is always being released from sediment. It happens all the time. Plants are using it. There's other organisms that are in the sediment that are using that phosphorus. So there's some being liberated. But under those anoxic conditions, the liberation rate is up to about 20-fold greater. So on a per meter squared basis, you're talking about a lot of phosphorus over a short period of time that gets released. And as you said, in Cornell, and Dr. Gilman has shown this repeatedly, that you get a mixing event and all of that phosphorus-rich water comes up to the surface and then stimulates a bloom. And some of that may come on the tail end of a rainstorm, and so people think, well, it's because it rained. Not necessarily because it rained. It's because the water column was destabilized.
And you can tell that by the temperature, because typically the readings from top to bottom exchange or have changed during the event, right?
And there's a tremendous amount, and that's one thing that I would say that you really owe the community, the Honeoye Lake Task Force and Association. I mean, we have collected a tremendous amount of data. There's over a terabyte of data in this lake. I've worked on many lakes across the country, and this lake has a tremendous amount of data, so it puts us in a pretty good position to evaluate, what's happening and how to best address it. But Terry Garnwall is here, and he collects a tremendous amount of data, and that data has been instrumental in helping us as scientists to figure out what's going on with the lake and how best to address and correct it. I should also point out, your C-SPLAT program, data that you as a community collect, tremendous asset, and it's a very unique program to New York, and it's something that, again, as a community, you should be proud of. Something that DEC should be proud of too. I know they're proud of it, but it's a very unique program that you don't see implemented in other states, and that's been a tremendous source of data, not only for this lake, but lakes throughout all of New York.
With the motion from the aeration, getting the cycling going, will it significantly change the temperature of the that portion of the lake coming out?
No, that's a good question. I mean, will it won't significantly change the, the surface temperature of the lake. That won't have an effect. So you've heard like some terminology, hypolimnetic aeration, destratification. Hypolimnetic aeration is designed to maintain a cold zone at the bottom and a warm zone at the surface. This lake is not a natural, naturally, is not suited for that type of aeration. This lake is suited for a destratification system. So your surface water temperatures, and you won't even be able to measure it. It's going to be inconsequential.
Other questions? Anything else? Any other questions for us? Okay, I think I'll close the meeting then. Just wanted to point out, this is email information where you can find out more, or you can send in comments, questions and whatnot. Let us know. We'll be hanging around a little bit if anybody wants some one-on-one time, but I just want to thank everybody for coming out, and we really appreciate all the questions you had for us tonight. Thank you so much. Good night.